Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and today I want to share with you 7 sci-fi books that surprised me. And for each of these recent reads, I'm going to let you know in what ways they surprised me, both good and bad, and what kind of readers I think might enjoy them. So let's get started with a bit of a 2-for-1. We have Tiamat's Wrath, Book 8 in The Expanse, and Leviathan Falls, the final book in the series. Overall, The Expanse is a 4-star series for me. I think that some of the books are really good, and some of the books are just decent. But Tiamat's Wrath is great. For a long time, the first book, Leviathan Wakes, was my favorite book in the series, and after having read 7 books, I thought that Leviathan Wakes was gonna finish at my number 1 spot. But with book number 8, Tiamat's Wrath, I finally have a new favorite Expanse book. So why was this such a nice surprise? I don't think this did anything out of character for an Expanse book, but it nailed everything that I enjoy in the series and it minimized some of the detractions. Sometimes the settings in the Expanse series can start to feel a little bit repetitive, but the locations in Tiamat's Wrath were varied and vivid, and I felt like the scale of the story felt really large and that the stakes were at their highest. Something The Expanse has always done well is the power dynamics between the different factions, and I think that this book had the most interesting game of chess being played. For a relatively fun and fast series, there's not actually as much action in the Expanse series as you might expect, but this book gave us some of the best action sequences in the series, as well as some of the most impactful character moments. And one of the most impressive things that it does is that it sets up the next book, the final book in the series, while still being a satisfying read in itself. I think that Tiamat's Wrath is an excellent space opera and pretty much exactly what I want when I pick up an Expanse book. For me, it was a 9 out of 10. Moving on to Leviathan Falls, The End of the Expanse. This book also surprised me because the style and structure of this book is different to anything else that we've gotten in the series so far. It manages to wrap up the final trilogy while also completing the whole series in a format that is specific to this final book. To me, it was a moderately ambitious ending. The series wove in some intriguing threads throughout the series that I thought went beyond your typical space opera, so I was pleased when I thought that the finale leaned into some of those aspects. It does utilize a particular sci-fi trope that I have read a lot of times before, but it does put a little bit of an interesting spin on that trope, so it didn't feel too repetitive. And lastly, I think the final book did the characters justice. This is a somewhat character-focused series, and I felt like the character choices were believable, and the story served the character progression that we've seen across the entirety of the series. The story and pacing weren't quite as engaging to me as Tiamat's Wrath, but overall I enjoyed Leviathan Falls and thought it was a fitting ending. For me, it was an 8 out of 10. Okay, next up we have The Drawing of the Three, Book 2 in the Dark Tower by Stephen King. This book wasn't what I expected, but who knows what to expect when going into a Dark Tower book. This book blends sci-fi, fantasy, westerns, horror, and probably a lot more than that. This book isn't overly sci-fi, but there are some sci-fi tropes like time travel, and I've heard there are others later in the series, such as robots, so for the sake of keeping the channel on brand, we'll say it counts as sci-fi. The Drawing of the Three is quite different from The Gunslinger. Trying to describe The Gunslinger is a little like trying to recall a dream, or perhaps more aptly, a nightmare. The reading experience for me was rather disjointed and nebulous. The Drawing of the Three is somewhat easier to follow. What exactly is happening and why isn't always clear, but the direction of the story is much more apparent. There are defined sections, but they're much more clearly connected, which provides a smoother flow than in The Gunslinger. This won't be news to anyone that's read King before, but he's an excellent character writer, and the dialogue in this book can be very entertaining. He quickly establishes rather complex characters, as well as others that are just downright despicable. I'm fully on board for this weird journey. My only minor criticisms stem from it perhaps losing a little bit of steam in the second half, but I'm still very much looking forward to reading The Wastelands, which I'll be picking up in May. I gave The Drawing of the Three an 8.5 out of 10. Up next, we have Horus Rising by Dan Abnett. This was actually my patron pick of the month for March. The Quantum Wheel landed on Horus Rising as nominated by Dan from Treebeard Book Reviews. If you'd like to vote on what I read each month, check out the link in the description to my Patreon memberships. So this is a Warhammer 40k book, and it is the first in the Horus Heresy series. I have never played Warhammer before, and I have never read a Warhammer book. All I knew going into it was that I had heard it was action-packed, and I expected it to have a sense of fun. There is no fun in this book, no sense of levity, no hint of irony. This is a very dark book that takes itself very seriously. And when I've mentioned this, I have inevitably been provided the Warhammer quote, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war." So that disconnect is on me. I didn't know what I was getting into. So once I realized what type of book this was going to be, did I enjoy it? Well, one thing I did enjoy was the level of detail in the world building. This is a fully fleshed out universe with a rich history. Also, when it came to the action sequences, I enjoyed that the book dialed the action up to an 11. I thought the last 20 pages or so also answered some interesting questions and set up some intrigue for the next book. So will I be reading the next book? I don't think so. This book didn't really work for me stylistically. It read more like fantasy than sci-fi, and it took itself very seriously, but the characters to me felt one-dimensional, and the thematic explorations were only surface level deep. I kind of wanted it to pick one of two lanes, either embrace a sense of fun and self-awareness, or go for something really deep and gritty. And for me, it just didn't really succeed in any particular area. I think this is something you might enjoy if you're already familiar with and a fan of Warhammer. For me, it was worth the read, but I don't think I'm going to continue with the series. I gave Horus Heresy a 6 out of 10. Next up, we have Dying Inside by Robert Silverberg. This is my first Silverberg book, and I've heard Silverberg described as your favorite writer's favorite writer. Silverberg never reached a broad audience, so I suspected that his writing might not be the easiest to follow. However, this turned out not to be the case. Dying Inside is very readable, and I would actually argue that Silverberg's prose is some of the best in the science fiction genre. Part of me is surprised that this book didn't reach a larger audience because it crosses over into literary fiction the same way that Flowers for Algernon does. It's a soft sci-fi book where telepathic abilities is pretty much the extent of the sci-fi concepts. If I had to guess why Dying Inside hasn't reached a larger audience, I'd say it's probably because some of the content and language can be rather confronting. But if you can read a somewhat unlikable character, as well as some uncomfortable scenes, then I think you'll find a real thematic depth in Dying Inside. In the book, the main character's telepathy is fading, and the story follows him as he comes to terms with both a life and talent that he has squandered. There are several memorable quotes in this book, and one that stayed with me was, "Living we fret, dying we live." This was a unique reading experience that I gave a 9 out of 10. Let me know what I should read next from Silverberg. Alright, for our second last book we have Blindsight by Peter Watts. I had heard that Blindsight was somewhat dark and nihilistic, but reading descriptions of strange characters on a spaceship made me still think that we might follow the classic trajectory of characters navigating their differences in order to overcome obstacles. But that's not at all what Blindsight is. Yes, we have a space mission with a character with multiple personalities, a character with half a brain, and a character that's a vampire. But Blindsight isn't so much about different personalities, so much as it is about different levels of consciousness. I found Blindsight somewhat of a hard book to get into. Details of this future setting are revealed quite slowly to us throughout the book, and the technical descriptions can feel like quite a lot to process. There also aren't any likable characters or any clear reason to get emotionally invested in the story other than an impending sense of dread. But as the pieces fall into place and the theories of consciousness become apparent, the final 100 pages of this book just hit me like a wrecking ball. I can't say that I loved the Blindsight reading experience, but after having finished it, I've thought about this book as much as I have any other, and I think that's a massive achievement. I gave Blindsight a 9 out of 10. And for our final book, we have Revelation Space by Alastair Reynolds. Alastair Reynolds is one of my favorite writers. I've read 3 books from him and really enjoyed all of them. In the order that I read them, I gave House of Suns a 10, Chasm City an 8, and Aversion a 9. So the bar for Revelation Space was pretty high. I found the opening of Revelation Space to be intriguing, although I wasn't fully hooked. And then the middle of the book I found to really drag. Alastair Reynolds has always been a writer that focuses more on the ideas than the characters, and while Revelation Space does have some world-building mysteries that I found rather engaging, I found the characters in this one to be particularly plain. The plotting also felt weak for Reynolds, as the trajectory of the story felt like this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. To me, it lacked a clear sense of direction or momentum. When combined with the forgettable characters, this was the least invested I've been in a Reynolds book. However, this book really exploded in the last 150 pages. It was just packed full of the incredibly imaginative ideas that I know Reynolds is capable of. I loved the ending to Revelation Space, and it made me excited to continue the series. Considering this is a somewhat hard sci-fi book from a debut author, I actually think the prose is rather readable. But the structure and the pacing left me feeling somewhat disconnected from the story, and I think that's definitely an area where Reynolds has improved over time. For those reasons, I think this might not be the best place to start with Reynolds. If you're new to Reynolds and want to try him out, you might be better off picking one of his standalones instead. I gave Revelation Space a 7.5 out of 10, and I'll be reading the sequel Redemption Arc in June. So let me know what you thought of these 7 books, and if you have any other surprising sci-fi books, feel free to share those with us on Discord or in our Patreon hangouts. Check out the link in the description to see how you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima and a New Eden. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just lightly tap the subscribe button, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.